yourselves. Welcome to Section 3, the Lieutenant. This video will go through the analysis of the key event and the significance of each of these. Let's go to the next slide. This is a plot summary. It looks at the major events of this section. We've gone through this one in class, so I'll skip over this really quickly to go into each one with more detail. Let's look at native engagement. The first key event is that Rooke engages with Warungan. You may remember him as he had formerly escaped from the colony. Warungan was very afraid when he was captured by the British Marines. Now, Warungan then approaches Rooke, making a voluntary step to form a relationship with Rooke. The reason behind this could be that because of Rooke's physical isolation from the other British, it makes him a lesser threat, so Warungan may feel comfortable doing this. It's also coupled with the fact that Rooke had made previous attempts to communicate with the natives using language, and he was less intrusive than Silk, who was following them around with a notepad, but also Surgeon Waymark, who fired at them. Rooke isn't a threat, so Warungan does come to him. The next thing that happens is that a group of natives decide to visit Rooke's hut. The natives are more accepting of Rooke, and they now feel comfortable enough to enter and inspect his hut. They're very curious about the new world. This type of investigatory relationship works for both parties. They have a keen interest to get to know each other, which they initially do in a careful and considered manner. But just keep in mind that this is only with Rooke. This is not with the other British, who seem quite threatening. Remember, Rooke is a special type of character, and this might be the reason that they choose Rooke. After this meeting, Rooke starts to fantasize about his future discoveries. Remember that Rooke is really looking for a purpose in life, and he sees that perhaps he can discover the native language. And he's failed at finding the comet. He's really failed at being a Marine. So for him, this gives him a new purpose at the colony. And it allows him to focus once again on developing as a person and to develop his career. He thinks that he is going to make a significant discovery, but does this for his personal interests, not necessarily like Silk, who is in it for some type of reward or compliment or potential financial gain. Again, Rooke's different. Let's go to the next section of the text. Changes in the colony. Now, this section opens with Tagaran, who returns and teaches Rooke more of the native language. Rooke has finally found a relationship which he can be himself, remembering that this is a friendship, not an intimate relationship. He decides to let down his barriers and feels quite relieved that he no longer has to perform socially. Remember, he really struggles with the social side of things. Now, with the Indigenous, he doesn't feel that he has to pretend to be anything other than himself. From childhood, Rooke has only ever felt comfortable in the company of his sister Anne, and he sees a lot of Anne in Tagaran, and this foreshadows their future friendship. Things start to develop with Silk. Silk is transferred to Rose Hill. Now, Silk is motivated by the thoughts of advancing the novel that he's writing. Rooke is increasingly aware that his interactions with the natives might have consequences, and he decides to hide what he's doing from Silk. He doesn't want Silk benefiting from him, but also at the same time, he realizes that the other British don't interact with the natives the same way he does. and that things are quickly going sour. He is not disturbed by the fact Silk, who was once his closest friend, is being promoted above him. Rooke now has his own agenda and is more concerned with the natives than with Silk. We also return back to Lieutenant Gardner. So you will remember that Lieutenant Gardner was in charge of capturing Wurrungan and the other natives, and he had a lot of remorse about that. Now, Gardner has now been told that he needs to lead a team to Norfolk Island. Now, this is really far away. The informal expulsion of Gardner to Norfolk Island foreshadows the consequences of not following the orders or failing to share the ideas and belief of the British colony. Gardner was the one who decided that capturing the natives wasn't quite right, and he was a little bit too vocal about that. And as such, they've sent him away under the guise of going on this expedition. This is not going to be fun. Rooke realises that he will now have to be more careful to avoid a similar fate due to his relationships with the natives, and that this is really against the party line. They're not encouraging native and British relations at this point. Let's look at the next section. This is about the development of the relationships with the natives. So despite everything going on, Rooke still continues to develop his relationship with the natives. Firstly, Targaran and another woman, Wurrungan, spend the night in Rooke's hut. This event showcases community. It's about sharing culture with the girls, and it's not about intimate relationships. Through this experience, they can see that there are a few core differences between the British and the natives. Even though they have this language barrier, they can still develop as friends and communicate in other ways while they're still learning. Again, this is not about an intimate relationship. This is about getting to know each other and getting to know each other's surroundings. The next event significantly highlights the cruelty of the British. Wurrungan witnesses British justice. This is the event where there is a flogging that takes place within the colony. Rooke's thoughts in this event show his emotions, and his independent thoughts are becoming more pronounced, in contrast to the hanging earlier in the novel. Rooke is continuing to develop his own moral compass. He still believes to some extent that violence and duty play a part in society, but he's quite horrified that the British continue to use violence to control people. As a Marine, Rooke has no choice but to observe this man being flogged for stealing potatoes. He must not question and he must not act. At the same time, he stands there watching the native Wurrungan, who is absolutely horrified at what's going on. Yet, Rooke can do nothing. The reason that Rooke does nothing is because this is his duty as a Marine. He has fear that there will be reprisals against him if he is disobedient. This is one of the most significant events in the text. If you haven't read this far into the text, this is the section that you should come back to. Let's move on to Rooke and Silk's relationship. Now remember, Silk was once the most important person in Rooke's life. And early in this section, Silk returns from his post at Rose Hill. When Silk returns, he finds that Rooke has changed and the friendship is strained. Rooke keeps secrets from Silk to protect his own work. Their lives have moved in completely different directions. Silk has become a more dutiful soldier. However, Rooke, he just wants to advance socially with the natives. So we can see they're on completely different paths. During this interaction, Silk sees Rooke's note and he suggests a partnership. This event highlights the disintegration of the relationship between the two men. Rooke has engaged in this work for his own self-interest, while Silk is quite preoccupied with fame and being published. The relationship is strained by the suggestion of a partnership, as Rooke believes his work is more important and noble than that of Silk's, because Silk's is literally a boring narrative about Rose Hill. It furthers the idea that the two men have completely different values and objectives at this point. Let's move on to the last bit. The assaults on the native girls. Now, this is the ending to chapter 3. It starts with Tagaran and the girls who complain to Rooke about attacks by white men. This shows the ultimate trust between Rooke and the native girls. They go to him in confidence with the expectation he will do something to protect them because he has cared for them in the past and they see him as their friend. It further accentuates the disrespect that white men have had for native women. When Rooke is told he wants to act, but he knows that he cannot. It further demonstrates the obedience Rooke must show, even if he's ignoring his own morality. In a similar fashion to the flogging, Rooke must not intervene with what is occurring, and he feels guilty for not helping the native girls. The girls leave and are quite upset, but Tagaran returns, wanting Rooke to show her how to use his gun. Now, Rooke doesn't want to teach Tagaran to use the musket because he's very unsure of her intentions and he knows this is against the specific rules of the colony. He's not allowed to show Tagaran how to use and load the gun. Waymark's original shot had a ripple effect, and it further indicates to the Indigenous that these guns are more powerful than words. Rooke does show Tagaran how to use the gun, but not how to load it. So he really hasn't broken the rules, although he kind of has. It leaves at the end of the chapter, Rooke is feeling used and realizes he's developing feelings of friendship with Tagaran. He's very disappointed because he feels Tagaran has used him just to find information, and he's worried that their connection is not that meaningful. This leaves the prospects of their future relationship uncertain, and Rooke looks once again for a purpose in life. That takes us to the end of section 3.